ISO Productions presents another instructional video tutorial from ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello and welcome back to yet another FileMaker tutorial video. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorials over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we are taking a look at the topic of using script triggers, understanding their sequence, precedence, and usage. Now, in versions prior to those which support script triggers, pretty much the only way that you could provide any type of user interaction was via a button. Now, in FileMaker, they have a native button object, and of course, you can define many other objects as buttons, but you really didn't have a whole lot of control over what would happen when the user moved around and did things within the user interface. As opposed to, say, your standard web browser, where you have all kinds of different events, FileMaker implemented event control within the form of script triggers. Let's take a look at the file and see exactly what we're talking about. All right, so here we have the file that you should have access to. If not, you can access this over at FileMakerMagazine.com/tools, and you will be able to find this particular file for free and available. Now, I am not by any means the first person to fully explore script triggers. However, the file that I'm providing here is one that I could not find out in the rest of the web, and was something that I wanted in terms of a very easy to use script trigger reference and a tool that allows you to see what happens when triggers fire. Now, I must give credit where credit is due. I pulled and culminated a bunch of the ideas into this one file from a number of sources. In particular, as I switch over to my White Hat Aviator browser, Wim de Kort, and then also Mislav Kos, or Kos. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but hopefully I did it justice. I'm going to put this URL up on screen. That is at SalientConsulting.com/blog, and I can see that it's actually cut off here, but you can see that up in the URL here. I'll actually zoom in so that we can see that. That's at /blog/2014-01 script-triggers-FileMaker-13. You get the idea. Now, this is an update to what was provided by Wim and Mislav for FileMaker 12. Now, script triggers were released in FileMaker 10, but only a few of them, and their evolution has really taken off, which is a real big boon to those of us using FileMaker as a development platform. Now, Mislav had a really good example. In fact, you can see that right here, the chart that he's got in this area, where he took this loop and he broke everything down into their constituent areas, such as window, layout. I know you can't read that on screen right now, but we'll see where all of these breakdowns come into play into the file that I'm providing as well. Now, the whole concept of when a script trigger fires and what happens as a result of the originating event. In other words, if I am hooking up to the script trigger of on window open, I'm expecting a window to open. The whole notion of pre versus post simply deals with, did the window open and does the script run after the window is already open or before the window is actually open? So that's really all that pre and post applies to. Whatever the event is, you just need to know, is the script that you're associating to that event going to run before or after? So you're able to take a look at this particular file that both Wim and Mislav has provided. He's got a graphic. Wim provided an extensive breakdown within a PDF. In fact, I believe if I switch over to preview, I have that right here where Wim took the time and put everything within a nice spreadsheet format. Now, this works as long as you can go in here and take the time to understand what's going on here. Why is this record green? Why are these records or these rows orange? Why are these white? Why are these yellow? Initially, I didn't get that right off the bat. There's nothing up at the top that describes what the coloring usage is. Wim also, as you scroll down, and there's a ton of information in here that's very valuable. As you scroll down, well, actually, it's not within this particular file, but in the version 12 file, he had a lot of short suffixes. So he would condense things like on window close to OWC or OLE. And looking at those acronyms was really sort of confusing for me when I was actually going through and wanting to understand the precedence or the firing order of when things would happen. Now, Wim also provided a really helpful file as I switch back over to FileMaker and switch to the window, which is a very helpful tool for understanding the sequence or the firing order of all script triggers. So basically what he did is he just created all of the different object types, which you can see this dialog pops up, mode exit, and it's doing that because I'm entering into layout mode. But if I click on any one of these objects, in fact, you should know this using FileMaker, that the way that you can access script triggers is to either use a modifier key or right-click on an object and actually specify the triggers on that particular object. Now, triggers only exist for certain types of objects and not for others. In particular, the division that you see up here up at the top, where we have our text, our line, all of our object tools, and then we get into our actual data tools or our user interface tools, which includes our field, our buttons and popovers in FileMaker 13, our panels and sliders, our portals, our charts. Pretty much all of these tools right here are the ones that can accept script triggers. Now, when you access the script trigger, of course, you can right-click and access this via the menu of the context menu of the right-click, and it'll show you all of the different script triggers that do apply. We can see that the on-panel switch is grayed because it doesn't apply to this particular container field, but it would on a slider or a tab. Now, the second way of accessing your script triggers is to simply hold down a modifier key, which is my preferred method. That is holding down Command on Macintosh or probably Control on Windows, and that will bring up the exact same dialog box. So that's a little bit easier than having to do that right click. But as I click through these objects, essentially you can see what Wim did is he simply selected and turned on all of the events. Now, one of the things that Wim doesn't have, which in particular is helpful, is the find that we have right here. Now, every script trigger or every event that is possible that uses a script trigger can be enabled oftentimes in multiple different modes of FileMaker's 4 modes, which are Browse, Find, Preview, and then I'm missing the one mode. What is the one other mode that I'm missing here? Let's go up to the View. Browse, Find, Layout mode. That's what I'm missing right there because that's not a typical user interaction mode. So looking at this, Wim did not turn on the find, and I've found that knowing what happens when you go into find is actually really helpful. You can also see, and I want to point out that at the bottom here, you can see this result area. Now, this result area where it says, if the script returns true, the original event proceeds normally. Otherwise, it is then canceled, or the event is canceled. So this is very important to pay attention when you're hooking things up. If you forget, basically don't have the time to open up the reference that I'm going to walk through, or you just want to know what's going to happen, you can look at the result as you cycle through these events because the result will change. You can see that the onObjectModify doesn't necessarily have a result with regards to canceling or what have you. You get to onValidate, we can see that basically if the script returns true, then we will continue the process. If it doesn't return true, so this is an important thing to note with regards to script triggers. It plays into the exit script step, which is a very important step to know when you're using script triggers. So we will see that when we take a look at one of the examples. This information right here is what's useful when you're going to consider whether the script is going to exit with a true or a false, and with regards to that event continuing. Remember, the event being, what did I select to have happen? If it was on open a window, I'm expecting a window to open. And if I canceled out of that, maybe the window wouldn't continue to open. And this all hinges on the pre versus post notion. So Wim's file, his original trigger test, was something that I liked. So I integrated that and the information into this one FileMaker file that makes it a lot easier for me to interact with and use as a resource. So the script trigger reference is what we have right here. Now the script trigger reference file that I've created allows me to cycle through or choose any of the major areas and has all of the critical information that I need depending on which version of FileMaker that I'm working with. You can see that all of the version information is actually contained right here, whether it was supported in 10, 11, 12, or 13. Whether the event is a post or a pre-event in terms of when the script will actually trigger. And then, of course, all of the scripts. And here we have the actual sequence. You can see this tooltip says the trigger name, relative firing order, execution precedence, and then version support. So what this means is that the on first window open has a precedence of number 1. That's the first script that's ever going to, or the first script trigger that's ever going to happen. And that's what this number means right here. Then you have your precedence of does it run post or pre the actual event, and then you have your version support. I've also integrated help on a version by version basis so that you can go in and get all of the specific details. And there is a notes section which I have right down here. Now you can go and take Wim's original document and copy all of his notes and put them into this file if you wish. I didn't want to basically steal his content and put it into this file. I just wanted the file to be able to use. Now everything can be filtered down based on their categories. You can see that I can easily select window, mode, record, and basically just see what are the script triggers that fall within that category. And of course, if I want to see everything, I go down here to the bottom and I see show all. Now what about that really handy file that that Wim provided, which actually shows you the actual triggering order? Well, I've got this little item right here up in the top of trigger testing. This basically opens a new layout with all of the triggers except for the window, the on first window open, the on last window close, and the on window open and on window close. I just didn't integrate those. My reason for rebuilding this was simply because I wanted to be able to use this on mobile, and I wanted all of the items in just a nice scrollable format where I could scroll down and see them on an iPad, etc. Now all of these objects, just like with Wim's original file, have all of their possible script triggers turned on, and they all simply reference one single script, and that is the on event. On event is simply taking an inbound parameter. Now Wim's supplementary file, the one that he's got in FileMaker 13, has a lot more features built in which integrate a lot of the companion functions that go along with some of the script triggers. In particular, the tabs and the sliders with regards to panels, oftentimes you want to know what is the intended target panel and what panel am I actually coming from. So in other words, if I'm going to use the on panel switch script trigger, which it comes with your panels and your sliders, if I'm going from tab 1 to tab 3, then I want to know or be able to know oftentimes that I came from tab 1 and ended up on tab 3, or if I go from tab 3 backwards to tab 2. Knowing that type of information requires the use of many of the available get functions that associate directly to triggers. You're going to find some of those with the on gesture tap and so forth. This trigger testing can be opened up at any time, and it can be opened up on mobile, and you can also see some of the unique things that happen as a result of some of the objects. In particular, if we take a look at a pop-up menu and I put that into my solution, what happens when I click on the pop-up menu? Well, as you would expect, typically, because I've clicked into this particular object, I would expect the on object enter to actually fire. But lo and behold, it does not fire when you initially select on a desktop using a pop-up menu. It will show the menu first, and then after a selection is made, then it actually fires the on object enter. So this gives you some clues by using this particular testing layout to know why is it not working maybe the way that I expect it to work, and if so, maybe I need to switch to another object, because if I go over here and you can see that all the triggers that are firing, there was a sequence of them. If I use the text drop-down, you can see that by clicking it does invoke the on object exit right off the bat. So that's what makes this testing layout so valuable. There are things that you can do when you're programming your FileMaker solution, as all of the rest of those triggers fire, that maybe you didn't know. For example, clicking on this button would allow me to trigger whatever script I want. If we go into layout mode on the button and we double click, we can see that all of the events have been turned on, all possible events, inclusive of within find mode and browse mode. But if I actually go to this object using a go to object, which is what this button has specified, you can see that when I click, I'm getting nothing except for the beep, which is assigned to the button. But if I click this button and go to a button, look what happens. I do get to take advantage of the onObjectEnter for a button object, provided I use another button object or another script trigger to go to that object. So this type of knowledge, this gives you the insight of how you can use FileMaker. Because for the most part, this button, even though it has available to us all of these script triggers, not all of them apply. In other words, this object may receive the onObject keystroke, but it doesn't really make sense to actually run in that context. The onObject modify doesn't make sense, but it's still possible. Hopefully in the future, FileMaker will start to gray these out, much like they have with the on-panel switch, where they don't necessarily apply. But again, that's what this particular layout is useful for, seeing what the triggering sequence is and what will happen as you interact with the user interface. Alright, so now that I've discussed the file and how you can use it as a reference and as a testing tool, we can walk through just one example of using a script trigger in order to see what the behavior is and how we can actually control it. In fact, this is one of the most important aspects of using script triggers. Because as you develop with FileMaker, if you start to throw on trigger after trigger after trigger, you quickly find out that you can easily make your FileMaker solution a very difficult to maintain mess, and also a performance killer if you're not aware of the fact that triggers, regardless, are always going to fire if they're turned on no matter what, because FileMaker does not have any method to disable them. So it is very much up to you to plan out your judicious use of your script triggers and to know how to actually disable them when things happen. So if we use this file as an example, very clearly if I click on this trigger testing can have an associated script, anything that is going to go to another layout in order to do things. And within the world of FileMaker, there's pretty much two distinct different operations when it comes to scripts. When a user clicks something that invokes a script, that script is either for the purpose of the UI or it is for the purpose of the business logic of your FileMaker solution. When it comes to scripts that are designed for the purpose of the business logic of your solution, you do not always want user interface specific things to happen. Yet there are many times that you will use user interface dedicated elements and layouts in order to do things within your solution. Say, for example, a very common thing within FileMaker is to go to another layout, which is either related or not, run some type of operation. Maybe it's creating a series of 20 records. Maybe it's going to a set of related records and then running a loop across all of those records. The problem is FileMaker's scripts, if those are script triggers, if those are activated, will run no matter what. So let's take the trigger testing as an example. When I click this and it brings up a new layout, we can see that by virtue of the very fact that there is a script trigger set for the onLayoutEnter, that we are getting this trigger to actually invoke and happen. Now your script triggers, or the scripts associated to your triggers, can be very complex and comprehensive, especially if it relates to the user interface. For example, I will have script triggers that are associated to an onLayoutEnter, so that when I go to a layout, I will determine if the view is list view, provided I allow the user to switch between form and list view. And if it is list view, I will automatically perform a sort, or I may attempt to whittle down the found set of records based on what the user was previously looking at, all kinds of things. But if I'm using a script for the purpose of business logic, not for the purpose of the user interface, I may not want this to happen. I may not want this trigger to even fire. And so that's where we get into suppressing triggers and taking control as the developer. And that's what the rest of this video is going to be about. The first part is understanding how to use this, how to implement the script triggers, and understanding when they fire and what you can do, whether you can cancel the event or not. And the next is how do you actually take control and suppress them. So we can see right here all of the triggers that are firing, and we'll walk through those as I close this window. But initially what I wanted to show you is I'm going to go to the layout scripts, and the on layout enter, which as I select and it loads FileMaker's help, we can see that it originated in FileMaker 10, and the event happens post whatever the trigger is going to run. So the trigger is going to run a layout enter, meaning the layout is going to be entered first, then the script is going to run post or after that actual event. So the script runs after we actually entered the layout. This is as opposed to the layout exit, for example. That is going to run pre-exiting the layout. So if we're going to close a window, then the on layout exit would actually run, but the script is going to run before the actual layout is exited. So that's one of the best examples that I can give with regards to understanding this whole notion of pre versus post. And this comes into play within FileMaker certification, understanding the pre and post nature of does the event actually happen before the script runs or after the script runs. And FileMaker's help also has this with regards to right here when the script runs. So reflecting back on the taking control part, what we have to know is we have to know that any script that is associated to a script trigger has to, in the very beginning part of that script, anticipate whether or not that script is going to be canceled. So if we take a look at the one script that I have in here that deals with this situation, we can talk about the naming of the script first, and then second, what we're actually going to do to catch whether or not this any associated triggers should or should not run. So first and foremost, this is something that I believe I picked up from Chad Novotny, and that is basically naming your scripts associated to what they are connected to, and then just further elaborating out what that actual script is connected to. If I had a ton of different on layout enter scripts in the whole of my solution, it would be very difficult to determine what belongs to which layout when you name all of them on layout enter. And this is purely a preference thing, but I can tell you, once your solution gets to be very complex, it's much easier to identify a script as being something associated to a trigger if it has the same name as the trigger being used. Otherwise, if this was named something like run people fixer, that becomes very generic and nondescript to where it's associated within the user interface. However, if I name it on layout enter, because it is an on layout enter script associated to that trigger, and then further elaborate and call it whatever I want, if it's a people layout or if it's an invoice layout, say on layout enter invoices layout, we get a very descriptive script name that tells me that this script is a trigger and so forth. And you can put information in from a documentation standpoint as well. But you can see that what I've done in the very first steps is a catch for disabled triggers. So in this scenario, we are creating a script that is part of the business logic of our FileMaker solution. It doesn't deal with the user interface, going over to a layout and letting a user navigate there. It deals with my particular business process, which let's say is opening a layout that the user also happens to use for the user interface. Now, a good segmentation approach would be using dedicated utility layouts that maybe don't have script triggers associated, but sometimes you want to multi-purpose your layouts. And if they do have script triggers associated, we want to know that any script trigger script can anticipate the fact that all script triggers have intentionally, by developer design, been disabled. This is where the script trigger custom functions created by Jeremy Bonte come into play. So this script right here on layout enter, and I'm going to call it trigger testing because that's the actual script that I'm going to associate. Currently, if I take a look at that layout is specifying the on event script in order to tell me the events that are actually happening. This I'm going to reassign as the new script trigger of the on layout enter for the trigger testing layout. And what we will see is that we are using this if not triggers are active. In fact, as I bring up the custom functions, you're going to see that there is a set of 4 of them. There is triggers are active, triggers disable, triggers enable, and triggers reset. Now the first 3 are the important ones that you typically want to use all the time. The last one, the trigger reset, is in case you come across problems where you just need to for sure know that you're going to wipe everything out and start from scratch. Now I won't go into these and go in depth into them, but basically they're using reserved global variables in order to track the name of a given script that either disables or enables script triggering. And so you can have a sequence. If you have 5 different scripts calling each other in a call stack, script A calls script B, calls script C, calls script D. At any time throughout the course of all of those scripts running, you may or may not want script triggers to actually fire. Now remember, all of your scripts that are associated to triggers must anticipate whether or not they should run, based on whether or not they are enabled or disabled. That is that 3-step catch right here at the very beginning of any script that is designated as a trigger. From that point forward, in the rest of all of your scripts, you have the ability to enable or disable scripts. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up the trigger testing, which we can see that it fired my event. I'm going to go into layout mode. Now there are multiple ways that you can actually modify your script triggers. I should point this out. The first is on the layout, when the layout is actually in layout mode, you can go to layouts and you can select the layout setup and then select the script triggers. The alternate method of modifying any triggers on a layout basis is to go to your manage, go to your layouts, and then within your list of layouts, you're able to double-click on the layout itself, which will bring that layout setup dialog up, allowing you to access script triggers. Sometimes that's a little bit easier because you don't actually have to go to the layout, go into browse mode, etc. But you can see that the onEvent script has been specified for the onLayoutEnter script trigger. I'm going to change this event to the onLayoutEnter, correspondingly named trigger testing. Now what I'm passing is I'm passing the parameter of what the trigger name is in this case, and that's just so that the dialog can display that using a simple show dialog. So we'll click OK, and now that we've reassigned the onLayoutEnter trigger to my script, which will now use a catch, all I have to do is know that any other script that I create in order to navigate to that layout will allow me to catch whether or not the script should fire or not. So currently, the way that I'm invoking that window is I've applied a step on this button directly which uses a goTo related record. Now that's not going to work because I need the ability to disable or enable any scripts that are watching for the fact of whether or not they should or shouldn't run, any scripts associated to triggers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the scripts and I'm going to create a new script which is basically goTo trigger testing. So this is just my standard navigation script. And in fact, I can put a goTo layout, select the layout of the testing layout, and this would basically work exactly how I would expect. The trigger would fire, however, I haven't done anything with regards to saying whether or not the triggers should or should not fire. So this is very easily solved by using one simple set variable, and actually it's usually a set of two so that you can control when the triggers are on and when the triggers are off. So if we use this set variable, and in FileMaker standards we have this notion of a garbage variable or a not variable, which is basically the exclamation point, which in many other languages means the inverse of an equality operator. It's the not operator. So in this case, I'm saying set a garbage variable that I don't care about, that I can always use as a temporary variable, to use the value of triggers disable. So all I'm doing right now, and what will happen, is a global variable will be set with the name of the script that was actually called where triggers were disabled. And then once I get there, I can actually enable any of my other triggers. So what I want you to remember as I copy and paste this value and put on the inverse of the disable and put the enable, you should get the sense that as part of my navigation, I get to determine, is this a script where the user's navigating to the layout and I do want the scripts to trigger, or I don't want those scripts to trigger and it's a business logic script. So in this case, what's going to happen is when I click the button after I reassign it, I will intentionally disable the triggers. I will go to the layout, and the trigger that is associated to the on layout enter has intentionally been set with the catch that says, if the triggers are disabled, then do not run the remainder of my script. This is what gives you full control over script triggers within your FileMaker solution. If you don't apply some type of principle, such as what I'm showing right now, then your script triggers can quickly become an erratic mess that is so difficult to manage that you throw in the towel and you say, oh, forget it, I'm not going to use script triggers and take advantage of them. I'll just revert to using just buttons in order to do everything. And that's where you lose some of the power within FileMaker. So having created my go-to trigger testing layout now, I can simply reassign this button to perform a script of the go-to trigger testing. So I now have my navigation script associated. And when I go into browse mode, what you're going to notice happen is when I came to this layout and brought this layout up, which event is not showing its dialog? Well, the on layout enter, and it's further proceeding to the next event, which is the on record load. So you can see that that particular event was suppressed because I had the catch part in the beginning part of the script, which is associated to that particular trigger. But of course, all of the rest of my triggers, they're simply just calling the on event directly. So the only event that did fire was the on record load. If I was to go in, and just like I did within the on layout enter, if I was now to create an on record load event and put this exact same catch in the beginning right here that says if not triggers are active, then I would be able to control whether that trigger fired or not as well. And I simply just exit the script. Now, the very last part of what we need to talk about is this exit script and what it actually returns. This is where you get into that dialog that we took a look at when we're here in layout mode, as it gives me my on mode exit. And when we take a look at all of the different events right here, when we select and we move through these, so you can see right here the result. If the script returns true, the original event proceeds normally. Otherwise, the event is canceled. This information right here deals directly with that exit script step. And it really plays in particular with the on-object keystroke, both associated on a direct object, which in this case is the container, and with the on layout keystroke. So there's two different places where a keystroke can be received. The first time that it's going to be received is if the user is in the field, the on object keystroke will fire, and then subsequently the on layout keystroke will be fired. Now, depending on how that script actually exits out, whether it exits out as false or as true, the actual key that was used will or will not get passed along through to FileMaker. Here, let's run through an example. I select into, well, this container field is a bad example. Let's take the number field right here. I'm going to specify an onObject keystroke event for this number field. I click into the number field, and of course the onObject enter will fire. Once I'm in there, I'm now going to type the number 1. I type the number 1, and I have the onObject keystroke set. This particular script, once I go into it, if that script is looking for the value of 2 and not the value of 1, that's when I have the opportunity to cancel out the fact that I still had typed the 1 and it has not gone into the field yet. So if we take a look at our scripts and we go to, let's go to the one where I was talking about, the exit script, if based on whatever conditions I say, by the fact that that result within the script trigger event said that if you return a false result, then what was actually done will get canceled, does get canceled. So here, if I take this exit script, and my script says if, and again, I would need to use a companion function, get inbound keystroke or something to that effect. You would need to look at the information, but I'll write this in pseudocode. If the key pressed, by user, this is all pseudocode, does not equal 2, then what we're going to return is false, otherwise true. So that pseudocode right there, in fact, I can make it non-pseudocode by simply putting a variable right there. That right there says, if this was at the end of a script, again, your exit scripts, you can have any number of them within your FileMaker solution at any given point. If a condition is met, you can exit the script. At the very end of your script, you can exit script, and you decide whether you actually return a result that is either false or true. If the result returned is false, then as stated in that dialog, for that particular trigger, the remainder of the event will not happen. And in this case, the remainder of the event was the actual key value of what the user had typed. So if I intercept what the user typed, it's not what I want according to my logic, and I return a false, then that value will not go into the field. And that is what can be used on any of the possible scripts that tell you that there is a result, and as a result of what you get back, you get to control, you can return a false or a true using the exit script with that trigger in order to determine whether or not the remainder of the event should actually run. These are the key points to taking the most advantage of FileMaker's script triggers. 1, understanding when that event is going to, when the script is going to run in relation to the event. That's the whole notion of the pre versus the post. Number 2 is understanding that you can take control, but you have to exercise your control within the beginning part of any script that is specified to be associated with a trigger. And number 3, the fact that if the particular event being used allows you to cancel the subsequent action, you can do that, but only with the exit script step and by returning a false as opposed to a true. If you use the exit script by itself with nothing, that defaults to a true value. You must explicitly put in a false value as part of your exit script in order to cancel carrying out the remainder part of the behavior depending on the actual step. So there you have it. There is my extensive and exhaustive explanations of how you can take advantage of script triggers within FileMaker and do it with all of the flexibility and power you truly desire, without having to give in to FileMaker's notion of, if you turn on a trigger, I'm always going to run no matter what. You want to be able to, as the developer, say when triggers run, when they don't run, and whether or not you want to carry out the remainder of the actual event that happened where the script is tied to that particular trigger. Hopefully in the future, FileMaker will address our ability natively in order to enable and disable triggers. It would be a really big boon to development. We wouldn't have to have all of the extra custom functions and putting it into all of our scripts, but for the current time being, it's not that much of a hassle in order to exercise that degree of control. So, as with all things, I wish you much luck with your own FileMaker solution. If you have any tips or tricks related to triggers, please post a comment on this video. It will be helpful to anyone who's watching it. And as always, I wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.